Thank you very much, Professor Quayson, and congratulations on your new publication and your many, many successes, and I wish you well. Now, if a friend in the street of Accra or Nairobi asked you about the content of this book, what would be your response?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Now, of course, the idea of tragedy, there's a popular conception of tragedy. So you see in the newspapers, the tsunami in Japan was a tragedy, or the politics of the politician of the Nigerian leader is a tragedy, and so on and so forth. In that popular cultural sense, tragedy just simply means sad or bad. However, the term itself has a more elaborate critical genealogy, and there's a way of dating the point at which it moved from the specialized sense of tragedy to the more popular cultural sense of sad or very bad. Now, when you look at the critical genealogy of the concept of the term, you find that you have to trace it from the Greek theater. So there's no serious account of tragedy that does not go back to the Greeks. So you go to the Greek theater and then you track its expressions typically in the theater until the end of the 18th, early 19th century. It was mainly concerned with theatrical production. But there, tragedy really meant a number of things. One most important was bad things happening to good people. But bad things happen to good people in a particular kind of dramatic infrastructure where a person might suffer a reversal of fortunes. They will lose everything. They will lose their love object. They will lose even their ideals that they lived for. So this reversal of fortunes leads to a loss of bearings, or moorings and so on. So tragedy meant that for a long time. And when I say it leads to a reversal of fortunes, I'm also thinking specifically of Aristotle, who theorized tragedy and in the Poetics, and everyone that goes back to him to understand tragedy. However, after the end of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the concept and expression of tragedy begins to migrate. It migrates first into philosophy, and then subsequently into other venues such as the opera, the novel, and so on. So now you see different venues for the expression of tragedy outside of the standard theater. So now, if you were talking about the history of tragedy, you would have to think about the history of tragedy as expression in the novel, the African novel, and so on. So this is how I would start. However, in my own attempt at, as it were, rerouting the concept for application in African and postcolonial literature, there are a number of things that I highlight. First of all, even Aristotle, when he was discussing the concept of tragedy in the Poetics, he was not actually thinking of the political and social framework of the tragedy. So this not his interest in the Poetics. The Poetics is mainly about form, the form of theater, and how it correlates reversal of fortune to certain, what he calls it anagnorisis, or understanding, a renewed understanding of a person's position within the unfolding drama. He doesn't talk anything about political conditions and so on. When we come to postcolonial tragedy, you have to think about the political conditions that make it impossible for one to live ethically. So this is where I take it from, that in fact, there's something inherent to the colonial condition, because the colonial condition denigrates the personhood of the black man or woman, denigrates their personhood. It puts limitations on their self-expression through language, through their traditional cultural forms, and so on. So that actually the resources for remaining or making heroic and ethical choices. Because tragedy, the reversal is not just about the reversal of fortunes, but the reversal of the capacity to be ethical. So this is a complication to the notion of tragedy. So the tragic character doesn't just suffer because they've lost their house or their property. They suffer because the basis on which they can act ethically has been destroyed. Now, colonialism does that, and you can see in different, theaters of the colonial, different parts of the world, how the colonial system made it impossible for us, or difficult, not impossible, to remain ethical in our choices. It rendered a certain mood of impossibility or difficulty. Now, one of the effects of colonialism, I've already mentioned the denigration of personhood and so on and so forth. But one of the more subtle and actually quite damaging effects of the colonial encounter was the degree to which it served to, as it were, ambiguate our attitudes to our past. Now, the ambiguation, there's a form in which the ambiguation is quite clear. Christianity. So Christianization, they tell us that your dances are pagan, or the way you dress is pagan. But even though they have said that, we still participate in rituals of naming, for example, our marriage rituals and so on. But for people who have been westernized and Christianized, especially in the early stages, there is an ambiguation of the attitude to that past, the past which is traditional. Now, this ambiguation then leads also to, as it were, a scrambling of the ways in which we choose who we become. Now the ambiguation idea. So I take the ambiguation idea. The ambiguation idea is illuminated in many postcolonial tragedies. Take, for example, Chinua Achebe's Either Things Fall Apart or Arrow of God. Arrow of God is even better. Because whereas Things Fall Apart, the colonialism was only incipient. We only see the colonial authorities at the very end of the novel. The novel is committed to showing the valence and the reputation of a traditional Igbo, in this case, Mofian culture. And colonialism appears in the last third of the novel. But when you come to Arrow of God, which is a kind of sequel to, or historical sequel to Things Fall Apart, in Arrow of God, the colonial authorities are already fully present. They have their headquarters at Okperi. The Ezewulu is the chief priest of Ulu. Now this, we've moved from incipient to established, formally established. But the effect of the presence of the colonial, authorities and is also to generate a number of, what I will call different modes of aspiration. So, for example, in the novel, we find people who go and work for the white man as cooks. But this is, in a way, a form of improvement over what they at least to them, what they thought they were in their own traditional context. Actually, what has happened is that these new matrices of aspiration are also a marker of the ambiguation of attitudes to their own past. And the ambiguation also it has an emotional dimension, So you love your traditional culture, but somehow it is uncivilized. So the tragedy in many African literary texts is the tragedy of ambiguation. So we have reversal of fortunes also. We have a catastrophe also. We have all these things similar to in the Greeks and in Shakespeare. but the sources where they come from are completely different, because the political and social conditions of being human are not entirely in our control. We're always wrestling to make it happen. And so this is how I would, it's almost like a form of translation. I would have to translate it to the person asking me on the streets of Nairobi or Accra.
Take me through the biography of this book. How did you conceive the idea? How was the writing process, research, and how has the book been received?
Well, the way the book started, at the time I was a professor at the University of Cambridge in the UK. I had just been hired, and I was asked to teach or to help teach and by big I mean it is compulsory, so everyone does that paper, and it is simply called tragedy. So the tragedy paper, and I developed the area of African tragedy. So I used to teach classes on African tragedy. In November, this is 1995, I started the job in September 1995. November 1995, General Abacha hanged Sariwiwa. I was in my office when the news broke, and I was so shocked and shaken because, of course, Sariwiwa is a writer, dramatist, novelist, and so on. I was shocked that the Nigerian regime at the time had been so blatant in killing, basically assassinating, murdering, whatever they may like to call it, an environmental activist. Way before environmental activism became a thing, Sariwiwa was doing environmental activism, highlighting the dangerous effects of the oil mining in eastern Nigeria. Now, I remember I was in my office and I started thinking, what is more tragic? So I'm teaching literary tragedy. I'm tracing it from the Greeks through Shakespeare to African literature. But what is more tragic than a writer, no less, being hanged? He was hanged by a government in Africa, in a part of the world that is very close to me, to my concerns. So that unsettled everything I was doing. So I was teaching tragedy in the classroom, and suddenly I was forced to now consider what is the point of this teaching if it cannot illuminate the tragedy real that is taking place in the outside world. So I remember at the time, I was so unsettled that I decided to write. I wrote a piece in which I was trying to reframe Ken Sariwiwa's life as a tragedy similar to literary tragedy. I don't think that exercise was successful for a variety of reasons, and that is because the real life, the consequences of the hanging on the Oboni people and so on and so forth, I couldn't possibly have anticipated what all the full consequences might be. So yes, it was tragic. Yes, there was reversal of fortunes and so on, but it wasn't tragic in the literary sense. So, but this was my attempt at least thinking it through. So that's how it started. And then I set it aside. So I published that piece and I set the whole enterprise aside. But it kept coming back because I was at the University of Cambridge for 10 years and I used to teach that paper every year. So every year, whether I liked it or not, I had to pose and answer the question again. So what I then did is that I took a detour through other books. I published several other books. But in fact, all my books have a tragic theme to them, silent in the background. So, for example, one of the books that I published was a book on disability, literature and disability. It's called Aesthetic Nervousness, Disability and the Crisis of Representation. And actually now thinking back, the Aesthetic Nervousness book was about tragedy. It's the tragedy of embodiment. So the embodiment, human body, but broken, disabled, and how they are invited to traverse the world and negotiate or navigate the world system in an unequal measure. So you talk about disability, both physical disability, people in wheelchairs, and so on, and also cognitive disability, madness, nervous conditions, and so on and so on. All these were part of aesthetic nervousness, but aesthetic nervousness was not an explicitly tragic book. In other words, I didn't read the disability through a prism of tragedy, but it was in there, because it was brokenness, it was the lack of the capacity to choose, it was reversal of fortunes, all of it was in there. It took me 20 years to write the book. So I've been thinking about it, I've been gathering material for 20 years, and I decided to now weave in all the many things I've been thinking about tragedy and so on, and then publish this book. Of course, another very important trigger for pushing to complete the book was the death of George Floyd, which was clearly a tragedy in the classical sense.
George Floyd should not be among the deceased. George Floyd's story has been the story of black folks, because
so that's how I say. The writing is now the gathering, the research took 20 years, putting this in, thinking about that, posing the question. The writing itself took, consistently about 18 months. And the book has different chapters. One is on, I've already mentioned Achebe. There's a chapter on Achebe and history. There's a chapter also on Othello and the failure of cosmopolitanism. There are chapters on Wole Soyinka, on Arundhati Roy, on Taib Saleh, and also on Beckett. Beckett forms the last. But basically what I was doing, I was doing a close attention or close readings of these different exemplars of tragedy. In terms of to getting it published, I already have or have had a good relationship with Cambridge University Press. So they were my first port of call, and they were happy to take it on. So in terms of getting a press, it wasn't that difficult. I had already published 2 or 3 texts with CUP, with Cambridge University Press. So this was just one of the things that I did with them. In terms of the after effects of the book, one of of course the book is only now making its way in the world. It's won an award, I'm pleased to say. But one of the after effects on me, as opposed to the general public, is how some ideas that appear in the book have now taken on a life of their own, which I'm hoping to develop for different publishing projects. In other words, the book has engendered an afterlife in my mind, in my consciousness. So there are parts of it that are now, threatening to separate themselves from the main text and become their own thing.
From your research and years of reflecting on the question of tragedy, what has surprised you the most?
Well, what surprised me is that in the course of rethinking what is tragedy, and I'm not the first person, people have thought about it many times, I also had to dwell on a particular facet of the tragic, which is suffering. So I also had to answer the question, what is suffering? Because part of the thing about tragedy is the display of suffering. The thing about suffering, though, is that, and here I have a working definition, which is also very useful because I can use that working definition to illustrate suffering outside the literary, so in real life. And my working definition of suffering is anything or things that make you either experience or fear a sense of the loss of self-integration. Anything that makes you either experience or fear the sense of loss of self-integrity or integration. And by this, I mean there are certain factors that impact directly your sense of self-unity. If you're poor, poverty, the lack of the means of self-support, the loss of family and friends. Aristotle uses the term philia, Philadelphia, the city of love. But really, philia means or refers to the mutual bonds of family and friends. If you lost all that, you begin to suffer. In other words, there are many types of suffering that do not necessarily lead to catastrophe, because most tragedies end in disaster. But my take was that to make this concept amenable to a postcolonial analysis, you also have to think of suffering without necessarily disaster. So I spent some time talking about suffering without catastrophe, and really it is the sense of discombobulation, of the loss of integrity, self-integrity, brought on by external and internal factors. That was a big surprise to me, and also a surprise because of the, as it were, the malleability of the idea of suffering and how you could extend it. In fact, the suffering concept is one of the things that has detached itself from the book, and I'm thinking about it more and more.
Professor Quayson, what else would you like to share with me about your book that I have not asked you?
Well, there's one thing. One of the things that has been unthreaded is the concept of disputatiousness. Now, in the Oxford English Dictionary, the term dispute has several entries. And one of the entries is disagreement with vehemence. So not just ordinary disagreement, but a sort of disagreement with vehemence. And there are many examples in literary tragedies of disagreement with vehemence. So, for example, in the Greeks, we have the classic, there are many examples, but the classic one that everyone will recognize is Antigone. Antigone and her uncle Creon have a disagreement with vehemence. The key feature of the Greek notion of dispute or disputatiousness is that the disputants are prepared to destroy themselves in pursuit of what they think is their side of the dispute. So Antigone says, I don't care if you kill me, I'm going to bury my brother. And Creon says, you're not supposed to do it. So this zero-sum disputatiousness, that is to say, I'm prepared to die for what ought to be destroyed for what I think is necessary, is a very important feature of the Greeks. But, and this is also important, the disputatiousness comes not merely from character differences, which is, by the way, what Hegel says in his theory of tragedy. He says that the disputants are in dispute not because one is wrong and one is right, but because both of them are right. So it's the rightness. We are both right, and that is why we dispute. But Hegel doesn't look at the historical context for both of us being right. But actually, there is a historical context, which is that in the Greeks, there was, I'm talking of 5th century Athens, there was an incomplete transition between religion and law. So the religious domain overlapped with the legal domain, to the extent that certain concepts had dual and contradictory meanings in one and the other. So the concept of decay, which means justice. Justice could either mean retributive justice, an eye for an eye, or reparative justice. So the two characters will both be using the term decay, but they mean completely different things. And this is because of the incomplete historical transition between the religious domain and the legal domain. However, what we find is this two dimensions. One is dispute with vehemence, but the dispute with vehemence comes from historical transition. When you pull back, you find that actually disputatiousness is repeated in different historical contexts. Let's talk about Africa. In Arrow of God, not so much things fall apart. In Arrow of God, there is and I mentioned Arrow of God before already. There's Izewulu. Izewulu is in big dispute with Nwaka. Nwaka is a businessman, and so the two of them dispute on what the god wants. What does Ulu want? The money man thinks that Ulu he ought not to be the person dictating to them what action they must take. But is the Ulu who is the chief priest of Ulu says no. So actually there's a struggle in the novel between a secular account of action and a religious ritual account of action. And both of these are being played out against the context of a historical transition brought on by colonialism. So disputatiousness is another thing that I'm threading it right now and thinking about it. Disputatiousness in different historical contexts. And the key thing is that both disputants are right, but they are right because they are articulating their positions in the face of a historical transition that ratifies both.
Very, very well done, Prof. Thank you. Thank you very much.